Opening intro, 60 to 90 seconds. August, 1858. St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. In the records of a sugar plantation, the numbers were supposed to stay neat. How many hands could cut cane? How many bodies could still work? How many children were old enough to carry water, sort seed, or survive to become prophet? That was the logic. Cold, ordered, profitable. But one night, that order broke. Not because a gang of armed men stormed the road. Not because the overseer was outshot. Not because the plantation suddenly grew a conscience. It broke because a black woman they barely noticed understood a truth the people in the big house never did. The most fragile lives were also the most important. If the children were lost, everything was lost. Her name, in this telling, is Hester Vale. 34 years old, nursery worker, midwife's helper. Keeper of fevers, tears, and burial cloths. A woman they treated as part of the machinery. A woman who watched children counted like future inventory and decided, in August of 1858, that she had seen enough. What happened next was not legend polished for comfort. It was strategy under terror. 60 children. One night march. One swamp full of black water, snapping jaws, hunting dogs, and men who believed every breathing soul in that marsh belonged to them. This is not a story about kindness inside slavery. There was none. This is a story about theft being interrupted, about motherhood widened beyond blood, about a woman the record books would have reduced to one line if they had recorded her at all, and about the night she led 60 children into the marsh so they would not be fed back into the machine. By the first week of August 1858, the Belle Cendre plantation was already running on the usual lie. That order meant stability. That discipline meant civilization. That ownership meant responsibility. The ledger books were clean. The yards were swept. The nursery cabin stood where it always stood, behind the smokehouse and just beyond the quarters, close enough for quick orders, far enough to keep crying children out of the main house. On paper, it looked managed. It was not managed. It was controlled. There is a difference, and that difference matters. Belle Cendre sat in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, along the wet, restless ground where cane fields bled into marshland. In August, the air pressed down like a punishment. The heat did not lift after sundown. Water sat in ditches and low places, breeding insects, fever, and the sort of rot wealthy men preferred not to smell unless it threatened profit. Children suffered first in places like that. They always do. That is one of the oldest truths in any cruel system. The smallest bodies pay first. Hester Vale knew it better than anybody on that plantation. She was 34 in the summer of 1858, though no record would have cared to preserve the number with dignity. She had spent years in the nursery cabin, in birthing rooms, in sick corners, in the spaces where women whispered over hot cloths and prayed children would keep breathing until dawn. She knew which infants had weak lungs, which boys still wet themselves when thunder struck, which girls had learned too early how to hold a smaller child on one hip while standing still under orders. She knew who had lost a mother to sail, who had lost a father to the fields, who had already learned not to ask where people went when wagons left the yard. Men like Overseer Silas Brigg believed strength lived in shoulders, fists, and obedience. They watched the young men, counted the strongest backs, worried about rebellion in the fields. They thought danger came with muscles and direct eye contact. That was their arrogance. They thought resistance would look like them. Hester understood something far more serious. If panic came, if flight became necessary, if the plantation cracked open even for one night, the children would be the first to die. Not in theory, in sequence. One toddler too slow in deep water, one infant crying at the wrong moment, one frightened child running toward lantern light instead of away from it. One feverish body too weak for distance. She had spent too many years watching loss arrive in small forms to mistake that danger. The people who claimed ownership over Belle Cendre did not see her as a strategist. That is because slavery had a blindness built into it. It misread intelligence when it lived in a black woman's silence. It mistook endurance for submission. It mistook service for loyalty. It mistook observation for emptiness. Hester moved through the plantation in plain sight, carrying wash water, changing wrappings, calming coughs, washing faces, listening. People like Brigg heard children crying as noise. Hester heard patterns: need, weakness, readiness, fear. On August 3, 1858, word began to move quietly through the quarters that a traitor was expected within days. This is how the system kept itself alive. Not only with labor, but with circulation. Bodies transferred, broken apart, priced, and moved. Adults were sold for debt. Teenagers were sold for expansion. Children were sold because the system refused to recognize childhood as sacred. It recognized only value. If a child could survive, that child could be counted. If counted, that child could be priced. If priced, that child could be taken. The language was always neat. The act never was. At Belle Cendre, the rumor spread in fragments. 3 boys, maybe 4, old enough for field training. 2 girls nearing house age. An infant bundled with a mother if the price suited the buyer. Nobody in the big house announced this as evil. Systems built on power rarely do. They call it necessity. Arrangement, transfer. They hide the wound behind paperwork. Hester did not need confirmation from the master's table. She knew the signs. The sudden attention to children's teeth, the extra washing, the questions about age, the way mothers grew quieter, not louder, when fear became certain. By evening, she had already begun counting in her head, not for the traitor, but against him. There were 60 children on or near Belle Cendre she believed could be moved if movement came fast enough and orderly enough. Not all from one mother, not all from one cabin. Some were half-grown and useful, some were barely walking. Several were still carried. The number was not poetic, it was practical. She counted bodies, strength, distance, noise, and the margin before dawn. Among the older children was Elias Reed, perhaps 13, thin as cane stalk but steady under pressure. Ruthie Quinn, 11, sharp-eyed, small-boned, already helping with infants. Benjamin Pike, 14, quiet, watchful, with a limp that worsened in cold mud but not in summer heat. Dinah, maybe 9, who could soothe crying babies better than many adults. Hester did not count by affection alone, she counted by function. Who could carry? Who could guide? Who could keep another child from freezing in fear? That is the detail polite history tends to erase. Rescue, when it is real, is rarely improvised innocence. It is organization. It is choosing under pressure. It is deciding that sentiment without structure gets people killed. By August 4th, she had started testing loyalties without using dangerous words. She asked one woman, Mara June, whether she could walk half a night with a child tied to her chest. She asked old Ben Tom if the marsh path north of Cypress Cut still held under summer water. She asked Elias how many younger children he thought he could quiet if dogs were near. Not one of these questions sounded like a plan when overheard. Together, they were a map, and all the while, the plantation kept performing its own innocence. Silas Briggs shouted at men in the yard. Mrs. Devereaux from the big house complained about linens and milk. A clerk updated figures by lamplight. Somewhere, perhaps in Franklin or farther, a trader arranged his route and expected to find flesh waiting. That was the structure. The powerful always assume the weak will remain where they left them. But Hester had crossed a line inside herself that could not be uncrossed. Years of tending children who were never protected had hardened into decision. She had prepared infants for sleep while hearing mothers sob after dark. She had wrapped small bodies that did not survive fever. She had watched children learn, too early, that adults could disappear between one sunset and the next. She had seen enough to know that memory itself can become a duty. When a system trains you to accept the disappearance of children as routine, refusal becomes moral work. So on the night of August 5th, 1858, before the lanterns began moving and before the dogs were called up, Hester Vale made the choice the plantation never imagined she was capable of making. She would not wait to see which children were selected. She would not wait for mercy that had never once arrived on time. She would not let the strongest run first while the smallest were left to chance. She began gathering them quietly, one by one, in the heavy dark behind the nursery cabin and along the edge of the lower yard, where the ground dipped toward reeds and black water. No speeches, no drama. Just instructions. Older child with younger child, adult with infant. No one alone, no running. No calling out, stay low, hold on, 60 children, not hidden in a ledger now. Hidden in the dark, and at the center of them stood a woman the record books would have treated as property, already proving herself more human than the people who claimed to own her. If you're listening from somewhere far from Louisiana, comment your city and country below. I want to know how far this story has traveled and who is helping keep these children remembered. On August 4th, 1858, the people who controlled Belle Cendre plantation still believed they understood their own world. That was their first mistake. Men who live by ownership often confuse possession with knowledge. They think that because they can count bodies, they understand lives. Because they can issue orders, they understand fear. Because they can punish movement, they understand silence. They understood none of it. What they had, in truth, was a shallow inventory. What Hester Vale had was memory. She was 34 years old that summer, and for more than a decade she had moved through the least respected spaces on the plantation and seen the most important things. Not the front porch where bargains were discussed. Not the account room where figures were polished into respectability. Not the cane rows where men performed authority with noise. Hester worked in the nursery cabin, in the fever rooms, near birthing pallets, beside wash basins stained with sickness and red clay. She lived where the plantation sent its smallest burdens and where women carried grief without witness. That is where the real record was kept. Not in ledgers, in bodies. In the nursery, Hester learned that children do not simply grow. Under slavery, they are assessed, measured for usefulness, observed for endurance, sorted by age before they are even old enough to understand what age means. A boy of 7 might still be crying for his mother at night, but to the plantation he was already future labor. A girl of 10 might still be afraid of thunder, but to the mistress she was already near the age to fetch, scrub, fold, and disappear into service. The language was always practical. That is how cruelty protects itself. It hides behind routine. Hester knew the children one by one. She knew that Elias Reed, 13, kept his fear hidden in his jaw and stood closer to the younger boys whenever raised voices came from the yard. She knew Ruthie Quinn, 11, did not waste words, but noticed everything: who was sick, who was hungry, who had been struck, who had not returned from errands. She knew Dinah Belle, 9, could calm a crying infant by rocking from heel to toe in exactly the same rhythm her mother once used before being sold south in 1854. Hester remembered that year because Dinah had stopped speaking for 12 days afterward. That is the kind of history official records do not keep. A sale date, perhaps. A transfer amount, perhaps. But not the silence of a child after separation. Not the way grief settles into the body and changes how a person walks through a room. Hester carried those details because nobody else at Belle Cendre considered them worth carrying. The plantation owners considered her reliable. That word, in such places, was not praise. It meant useful without complaint, predictable, present. Hester had learned how to survive their assumptions. She kept her eyes lowered when the mistress was near. She answered directly when spoken to. She moved quickly, but never in a way that looked urgent unless ordered. She made herself appear like part of the furniture of the system, indispensable but not fully seen. It was a discipline of concealment, and it kept her alive. By August 1858, Belle Cendre was held together by 3 visible authorities and 1 invisible truth. The visible authorities were plain enough. There was Edmund Devereux, the owner in legal terms, more interested in debt, yield, and sale value than in the lives arranged beneath those words. There was his overseer, Silas Brigg, who believed fear was management and noise was leadership. And there was Mrs. Celeste Devereux, who liked to imagine herself benevolent because she supervised linens, milk rations, and nursery cloth, as if neatness could wash the stain from ownership. Then there was the invisible truth. None of them understood the plantation as well as the women who kept children alive inside it. Hester had become, over the years, more than a caretaker. She was the one women called when fever climbed too fast, the one sent for when milk stopped coming after childbirth, the one who knew which herbs might settle a belly and which old woman in the quarters still remembered how to reduce swelling in a child's chest. She had helped bury infants. She had held mothers upright after labor when no physician was summoned because the life in question did not deserve the expense. She had listened while women counted their children under their breath, not because they had forgotten, but because remembering was the only possession left to them. So when rumors began to spread on August 3rd that a traitor was expected before the week's end, Hester did not react like the men in the yard would have. She did not look first at the strongest backs. She looked at the children most likely to vanish into the trade route or die in any disordered escape. She began sorting facts. Who could walk 2 miles barefoot in mud? Who would need carrying? Which children were old enough to obey even when terrified? Which adults could be trusted not to break formation if a dog barked in the dark? Which mothers would refuse to leave a child not born from their own body? That last fact mattered more than any overseer would have understood. Systems like slavery survive by narrowing love. They force people to think only in bloodlines, in ownership lines, in legal lines drawn by the powerful. But the quarters ran on a wider truth. Women held children not their own, Teenagers watched babies whose mothers were in the fields. Old men carried water for girls too tired to stand. Care was shared because suffering had been shared first. Hester understood that this, not the master's authority, was the hidden structure holding the human world together at Belle Cendre, and she knew it could be mobilized. On the morning of August 4th, she moved through her duties as if nothing in her had changed. She washed a rash on a toddler's neck. She checked the gums of an infant cutting teeth. She boiled cloth. She soothed Benjamin Pike's younger sister after a nightmare. But underneath that routine, she was making calculations with a precision the plantation had never imagined she possessed. Benjamin, 14, had a slight limp but broad shoulders for his age. He could carry a smaller child when ground was firm. Ruthie could manage an infant for short stretches if the baby was tied high enough. Elias could guide 2 younger boys if given a clear rule and a hand signal. Old Ben Tom knew the marsh edge north of Cypress Cut better than any man Brig would send after them, because he had trapped there in his youth before the plantation restricted movement. Mara June had lost 1 child to fever and another to sail. She would not abandon a third, but she would also not abandon anybody else's if ordered by someone she trusted. This was not inspiration. It was structure. Hester had no paper, no map, no right, in the eyes of the law, even to plan for her own future. Yet by noon she had built a human chain in her mind more disciplined than the plantation's own enforcement. She also knew what failure would look like. Failure would not come all at once. It would come in fragments, a frightened child pulling away, a toddler crying just as lanterns neared, a mother turning back at the sound of a name, an older boy bolting because terror is faster than reason. Hester did not romanticize courage. She had seen too much suffering for that. People under pressure do not become symbols. They become exhausted, desperate, and dangerously human. Any plan that ignored that fact was not a plan at all. So she began, quietly, to prepare minds before preparing feet. She told Ruthie while folding nursery cloth, "When little ones see fear on your face, they borrow it." She told Elias, near the water barrel, "If running starts, deaths start." She told Mara June in the smokehouse shade, "Hold the breathing steady first, the feet will follow." To anyone overhearing, these sounded like the sayings of a nursery woman worn down by hard seasons. In truth, they were field instructions disguised as common speech. Late that afternoon, Silas Brigg made his rounds with his usual swagger, glancing over the younger boys in the yard and cursing at a cartwheel that needed fixing. He saw Hester lifting a child from a bench and paid her no serious attention. That, again, was the weakness in men like him. They only respected visible power. They could not imagine that the woman wiping a child's face might be the most dangerous mind on the property, because danger, to them, meant attack. To Hester, danger meant losing the future. That is what this was really about, and it deserves to be said plainly. Slavery did not merely consume labor in the present. It laid claim to tomorrow. It reached into cradles, into wombs, into the unsteady legs of children and declared all of it available for use. Every nursery on a plantation was political ground, whether the powerful admitted it or not. Every child who survived was another unit of value to be controlled. Every mother knew it. Every caretaker knew it. Hester knew it with a clarity sharpened by years. By nightfall on August 4th, her decision was no longer forming. It was formed. She would not wait for confirmation from the trader's wagon. She would not wait for names to be called. She would not stand in the nursery cabin pretending neutrality while children were reduced to selections. She moved once more through the sleeping spaces after dark, listening to coughs, murmurs, restless turning. She paused over each small form and counted strength, weakness, need. Not as an owner counts. As a witness counts. As a guardian counts when no law will protect what matters. Outside, Belle Cendre settled into its false peace. Lamps dimmed in the big house. The account room closed. Frogs sounded from the low water beyond the cane. The plantation believed itself secure because it had fences, dogs, riders, and the law at its back. But in the quiet beneath that confidence, a black woman they had failed to count correctly was preparing to reorder the entire night. And by the time they understood what she had seen coming, it would already be too late. Night fell over St. Mary Parish on August 5, 1858, with the same heavy heat that had smothered the plantation for days. The frogs called from the low water. Insects scraped at the dark. The main house still held its lamps a little longer than the quarters, glowing with the confidence of people who believed the world would remain arranged for their comfort by morning. That confidence was misplaced. By then, Hester Vale was no longer thinking in rumors. She was thinking in sequence. She knew the window was narrow. If a trader arrived at dawn, it would be too late. If Silas Brigg made another round through the lower cabins, it would be too late. If one frightened child cried out before the line was formed, it might already be too late. Under a system built on surveillance, the first victory is often silence. Not silence of surrender, but silence of preparation. What Hester was preparing that night was not an escape in the loose, romantic form later generations like to imagine. It was not a burst of emotion. It was not desperate running in all directions. That kind of chaos satisfies storytellers. It gets people caught. What she built instead was discipline under terror. She gathered the older children first because they could understand the rule before the youngest were moved. Elias Reed, Ruthie Quinn, Benjamin Pike, Dinah Belle, Samuel Cox, 12, broad-handed and dependable. Little Mercy Tate, hardly 10 but calm in a crisis. Hester brought them in one by one behind the nursery cabin, where the shadows from the store shed and the old cistern broke the yard into darker patches. She did not waste words. You do not leave who is given to you. That was the rule. Not the strongest first, not the fastest first. Not blood first, not fear first. Nobody gets left behind. Each older child was paired with someone smaller. Each able adult was assigned one child, sometimes two if one was still carried. The infants were bound high to chests or backs with torn linen, feed sacks, and strips of worn blanket. Hester checked each knot herself. Too low, and the baby would slip. Too tight, and the child could not breathe. Too loose, and a panicked movement in swamp water might cost a life in an instant. She worked with the precision of someone who had spent years saving children in rooms where help came late, or not at all. That is one of the truths slavery never understood about the women it exploited. It assumed caregiving made them soft. It did not account for the steel required to keep children alive in a place designed to break families apart. By roughly 10 o'clock, the first of the little ones had been roused from pallets and corners, not fully awakened, only lifted and steadied. Hester knew a half-sleeping child could often be moved more quietly than a frightened one forced suddenly into motion. Mara June carried a boy of about 3 named Obi, still warm with sleep, cheek pressed to her collarbone. Ruthie took a little girl called Cora Bean, 6 years old, with a bad habit of asking questions at the worst possible time. Elias was given twin brothers, Jonah and Luke Farrell, both 8, told to keep one hand on each shoulder no matter what happened. Dinah received an infant, barely 6 months old, whose mother had collapsed from exhaustion the week before and could not be risked on the full crossing. Hester made no room for sentiment in the assignments. She made room for survival. This is where moral clarity begins to matter. The plantation had spent years teaching these people that separation was normal, that removal was legal, that children could be reassigned, sold, disciplined, counted, and priced as if they were items passing through storage. Hester answered with the opposite principle. Pairing was not simply logistics. It was a declaration of duty. Every child would belong, in that night's movement, to someone responsible. Every frightened body would have a witness. Every step would be shared. In a world built on the destruction of kinship, that was a form of resistance more serious than the men in the big house would ever have recognized. She moved down the line and repeated instructions in a low, flat voice. No running. No calling names. If you fall, the one with you stops. If dogs come near, you lower down and hold the child's mouth gently, not hard. If lanterns show, nobody looks at the light. It was the language of a field commander, but no one would have called it that then. The law did not permit black women on plantations the dignity of strategy. Yet there she was, on August 5th, 1858, organizing 60 children and a handful of exhausted adults with more coherence than the men who claimed mastery over them. Old Ben Tom arrived late, breath shallow, having checked the north edge near Cypress Cut. The marsh path was still passable, he said, but the western side had taken more water than expected. Hester adjusted immediately. They would move in a bent line, not a cluster, and keep closer to the cypress rise before turning east. She did not ask if anyone was afraid. Fear was already present. Naming it would not reduce it. Near the quarters, someone began singing softly to cover the unusual stir of movement. Not loudly, just enough that any listening ear from the yard might mistake the sound for another weary night settling in. That, too, was part of the hidden intelligence of the place. Survival under oppression is never only one person's work. Even silence has helpers. Even misdirection has accomplices. Still, Hester carried the burden of decision. She knew exactly what was being risked. Not only capture, not only punishment. Failure here would confirm every lie the plantation believed about black dependence, black incapacity, black motherhood, black childhood. The system wanted proof that only the owners could impose order. Hester intended to expose that as fraud. At around 11 o'clock, she made the final count. 60 children, not a symbolic number, a dangerous one. A line that long could fray at 3 points at once. The smaller children would tire quickly. The older ones, forced into responsibility beyond their years, might break down if the sound of dogs reached them too soon. 2 of the infants had coughs. One boy, Aaron Peak, walked with a twisted foot and would slow them in mud. Hester knew all of it. She did not pretend courage erased weakness. She built the movement around weakness because that was the honest way to keep people alive. They began from the rear, not the front, slipping past the nursery fence in staggered intervals so the group would not look like a mass if seen from the wrong angle. 2 at a time. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Then a longer cluster when the night insects rose louder from the reeds and covered the sound of feet brushing low grass. Hester moved up and down the line constantly, correcting spacing, tightening a cloth tie, settling a child, touching a shoulder once when words would only raise panic. Ruthie later would have remembered only fragments if anyone had asked. The smell of sour water, the feel of Cora's hand sweating in her palm, the sight of Hester's face turning and turning in the dark like she could somehow see everyone at once. That is how such nights live in memory, not as broad scenes, but as pressure points, a hand, a breath, a whispered order, the sound of a baby almost crying, then not. As they cleared the lower yard, the plantation behind them remained deceptively still. No dogs yet, no bells, no shouted names. For a few minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps less, the impossible thing held together in near-perfect quiet. 60 children moved out of Belle Cendre's human inventory and into darkness, and that is the accusation buried inside this moment. The plantation had claimed it maintained order. Yet the most disciplined formation on that ground was not the overseer's chain of command. It was a black woman, legally denied personhood, organizing the preservation of children while the so-called civilized world slept on feather mattresses and trusted theft to resume by daylight. At the edge of the first reed bed, Hester stopped them and made one final adjustment. The line was too tight. If one child stumbled, 3 would go down. She spread them wider, 1 pair every few steps, close enough to signal, far enough not to collapse together. She shifted Aaron Peak from Samuel Cox to Mara June, whose stride was slower but steadier. She took the smallest infant for herself. That detail mattered. Leadership in such moments is not standing apart. It is carrying weight where the danger is greatest. Then she looked once toward the big house, where one lamp still burned in an upper window. Maybe someone was reading accounts, maybe someone was drinking, maybe someone was planning sales for the morning and calling it business. That light stood for the whole rotten arrangement. Comfort built over fear, order built over stolen lives, confidence built over the assumption that the people below would remain where they were put. Hester turned away from it without ceremony. Ahead of them lay black water, roots, insects, mud, hidden teeth, exhaustion, and the long arithmetic of survival. Behind them stood Belle Cendre Plantation, still not understanding that its greatest failure had already occurred. The children had been counted again. This time by someone trying to save them. Before dawn on August 6th, 1858, Belle Cendre Plantation was still pretending to sleep. That is how systems of domination like to imagine themselves in the hours before a breach is discovered. Stable, guarded, unquestioned. The main house sat under its gallery roof with one upstairs lamp finally gone dark. The overseer's cabin was quiet. The yard dogs for the moment had not yet caught the wrong scent. The cane fields beyond the sheds held their usual stillness. To anyone looking from a distance, the plantation would have appeared intact. It was not intact. By then, Hester Vale had already drawn 60 children beyond the nursery fence, past the lower yard, and into the first belt of wet ground where the land stopped behaving like land. The older children were breathing through fear. The adults were carrying more than weight. They were carrying the terrible knowledge that if order failed even once, the smallest bodies would pay first. No speech was needed. The dark itself explained the stakes. Hester kept them moving north by the broken reed line, just west of Cypress Cut, where old Ben Tom had said the ground still held in patches between the pools. The route was not safe. It was merely less deadly than the others. That distinction matters. Too much history is written as though freedom routes were corridors waiting to be found. They were not. They were belts of risk chosen against even worse risk. Mud instead of lanterns. Water instead of whips. Silence instead of capture. There was no clean option. There was only selection under pressure. The line moved in stretched intervals, exactly as Hester had ordered. Mara June carried Obie against her chest. Ruthie Quinn kept Cora Bean close with a hand locked at the child's wrist, not because tenderness had vanished, but because panic makes children pull away from the very people trying to save them. Elias Reed guided Jonah and Luke Farrell with 2 fingers pressed at their shoulders. Samuel Cox carried little Nehemiah, whose fever had broken only the day before. Dinah Belle, 9 years old and already burdened beyond what any child should know, moved carefully with the infant tied high against her collarbone, while Hester stayed near enough to take the baby the moment her strength failed. Nobody spoke above a whisper. No names unless absolutely necessary. No weeping if it could be swallowed. This was not dignity in the sentimental sense. It was discipline forced by a world that had never granted these people the luxury of noise. At some point after midnight, the first mistake happened back at Belle Cendre, not among the runaways. Among the owners. A house servant named Clara Mays, sent to fetch fresh cloth from the nursery cabin for Mrs. Devereaux's youngest, found the place too quiet. No sleepers on the usual pallets, no small coughs, no half-asleep movement under rough blankets. Only disorder that tried to hide itself. Wrappings missing, 1 water dipper overturned, a stool tipped on its side. Clara understood at once what the white household would understand only in fragments. This was not one child wandering. This was absence on purpose. She did not raise the alarm immediately. That, too, deserves to be remembered. Resistance is often built not only by those who flee, but by those who delay the hand reaching for the bell. Clara stood in that cabin long enough to buy time. Perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 5. In a chase, minutes are human lives. But alarms built into a plantation do not stay sleeping forever. By roughly 1:30 in the morning, Silas Brigg was in the yard with a lantern and a voice that carried like a threat through timber and cane. He counted quickly, then badly, then again with growing rage. His first assumption was predictable: able-bodied men. He demanded names from the quarter rows. He sent for dogs. He shouted for the stable hands. He thought like an overseer thinks, toward rebellion in the fields, toward stolen labor, toward the insult of men refusing their assigned place. That blindness was Hester's advantage. Because while Brigg cursed the names of grown men, the largest movement of human life leaving Belle Cendre was already bending into Marsh shadow with children at its center. There is a special kind of arrogance in oppressive systems. They imagine danger only in the form they already fear. They expect force to resemble force. They expect defiance to announce itself loudly enough for them to answer with louder violence. They do not expect intelligence from those they have spent years degrading. They do not expect a black woman from the nursery cabin to redraw the night around 60 children and make the law look foolish. Yet that is exactly what was happening. By 2 o'clock the dogs were brought out. These were not mythical beasts, only hounds trained to turn scent into pursuit and pursuit into profit. On plantations, even animals could be folded into the machinery of ownership. Their hunger, their instincts, their obedience to handlers, all redirected toward returning human beings to the place from which they had tried to disappear. Men liked to call this order. It was not order. It was organized theft defended with teeth. The first barking reached the marsh edge in broken echoes. Not yet close, but close enough to move through the line like a tremor. Little Cora stiffened. One of the Farrell twins began to whimper. Mara June tightened her hold on Obie until Hester touched her shoulder once, a warning not to grip in panic. "Steady," she whispered, the word so low it barely existed. "They hear fear faster than feet." That was not superstition. It was practical truth. Children read adults first. If the line broke inward, sound would follow. If sound followed, the dogs would have less distance to solve. So Hester did the thing weak leaders never do. She did not deny the danger. She translated it into command. Lower down when I lower. Keep mouths covered soft, not hard. Do not rush the mud. Wait for the touch, then move. It was enough. Barely, but enough. Ahead of them, the first water crossing lay under a stand of cypress where the ground sank into black, slow-moving channels hidden beneath duckweed and floating debris. In daylight, it might have been mapped with poles and measured steps. In darkness, with 60 children and dogs somewhere behind, it became something harsher, a test of whether discipline could survive contact with terror. Old Ben Tom went first with a cut branch, probing the submerged path. 1 step, sink to the calf. 2nd step. Hold. 3rd step. Too soft. He shifted east. Hester watched his shoulders, not the water. Shoulders tell the truth faster than words. When he found firmer footing beneath the surface roots, she began feeding the line in 1 pair at a time. This was the moment the plantation would have called impossible had anyone described it beforehand. Children entering swamp water at night, some half-carried, some clinging to older children, all under orders from a woman the law did not permit to direct her own future. And yet the line moved. Elias took Jonah first, then Luke. Water to the knees, then thighs. Ruthie lifted Cora when the girl gasped at the cold and nearly cried out. Samuel carried Nehemiah higher as the child's legs knocked against submerged roots. Mara June slipped once, recovered, and kept moving. Dinah froze when the infant against her chest gave a sharp, thin cry. Hester reached her in 2 strides, took the baby, and sent Dinah forward, empty-armed through the deepest stretch. The water smelled of rot and plant decay. Mud pulled at ankles. Insects rose from the reeds in angry clouds. Somewhere farther off, something large broke the surface with a slow disturbance that told everyone exactly what kind of place they had entered. Nobody needed the word spoken. The marsh announced itself by sound alone. This is where polished retellings often fail. They turn danger into scenery, but the swamp was not background. It was an active threat, cold enough to tighten chests, deep enough to unbalance a child, dark enough to hide roots, sinkholes, and living mouths beneath the surface. Hester was not leading them through picturesque wilderness. She was taking them through a place where nature itself had no opinion about justice and would kill the weak as quickly as any plantation would. Still, it offered one advantage the plantation feared: confusion. Lanterns do not travel cleanly through standing water. Dogs lose certainty when scent breaks across channels in mud. Mounted men do not love terrain that swallows horses to the knee. The marsh, indifferent as it was, made ownership less efficient. That is why Hester chose it, not because it was kind, because it was difficult. Oppression depends on smooth ground. Behind them, the lights began appearing at the tree line, small at first, then multiplying. Searchers. Brigg had finally understood this was no ordinary absence. You can picture him then, somewhere at the edge of Belle Cendre's authority, lantern lifted, boots caked, furious not only because bodies were missing but because order had been mocked. Men like him take escape personally. Not because they care for the lives leaving, but because each disappearance exposes the lie that their control was ever complete. He would have seen broken traces near the nursery path, small prints, drag marks, a dropped strip of cloth. Enough to realize the truth in ugly stages. Children, not a handful, many, and a mind behind it. That realization mattered, because once the plantation understood children were at the center of the movement, the outrage sharpened. This was no longer only lost labor, it was lost future inventory, lost inheritances of coercion. Lost years of work they believed were still waiting to be extracted. The crime in their eyes was not brutality. The crime was interruption. By the time the first hounds reached the edge of the crossing, Hester had nearly half the line through. She turned back again and again, taking weight from the exhausted, reordering spacing, lifting a child here, steadying an adult there. Water soaked her dress to the waist. The infant on her chest had gone frighteningly quiet, but was still breathing. She did not let herself think beyond the next 10 steps. That is what leadership becomes under conditions like these, not speeches. Not hero poses. Repetition. Adjustment. Refusal to panic where panic would spread. Hester never confused courage with the absence of fear. Courage, on August 6, 1858, looked like moving frightened children through black water while dogs barked from the bank and lanterns searched for the shape of your failure. One by one, the line crossed. Not cleanly, not nobly, not without near disaster. But it crossed. And somewhere behind them, Belle Cendre plantation was beginning to understand something it should have understood long before. The people it had treated as property were capable of planning, protecting, and outmaneuvering the men who claimed to own them. That was the real scandal. Not that they fled, that they did it with more discipline than the system built to contain them. By the early hours of August 6, 1858, the crossing behind them had solved nothing. It had only bought time. That distinction matters, because too many retellings of escape turned the first successful passage into relief. There was no relief in the marsh, no moment where Hester Vale or the people around her could mistake survival for safety. The water behind them had confused the dogs, yes. It had slowed the riders, yes. But ahead of them stretched the real trial. Miles of wet ground, black channels, reeds high as a man's shoulder, cypress roots twisted like traps, and the constant possibility that one wrong step would turn discipline into loss. This was the alligator marsh north of Belle, Cendre, the place plantation men threatened children with when they wanted obedience. They described it as if the swamp itself were the law. Step off the road, and the marsh will take you. Cry out in the dark, and the marsh will answer first. It was one more way cruelty dressed itself as common sense. Yet now those same children had no other road. The place meant to terrify them into submission had become their only corridor out. The line regrouped on a narrow rise of half-firm ground under leaning cypress. Hester counted again. 60 children still with them, 2 barely conscious from exhaustion, 3 shaking with cold, though the August air was hot enough to choke. 1 infant fever warm, Aaron Peake's twisted foot already dragging, Dinah Belle breathing too fast after the crossing, Mara June unable to feel her right arm below the elbow from carrying Obie against her chest for so long. Old Ben Tom bent over his probing stick, drawing breath in measured pulls. Hester did not offer comfort she could not guarantee. That is another lie sentimental history likes to tell. That courage speaks in reassurance. Often it does not. Often it speaks in arithmetic, in assignments, in instructions harsh enough to keep people alive. She shifted the order at once. Benjamin Pike took Aaron's weight on one side. Ruthie Quinn surrendered Cora Bean to Mara June for part of the rise and was given the smaller infant bundle so her sharper eyes could stay close to Hester near the front. Elias Reed moved back to the middle where the younger boys were starting to unravel. Dinah, only 9 and already past the edge of her strength, was told to walk empty-handed until further notice. No arguing, no pride. Hester ran the line like a commander because that is what the moment required. This is where the moral fraud of the plantation world stands exposed. Men like Edmund Devereux and Silas Brigg claimed black people required supervision because they were unfit for self-government. Yet here, in a swamp they feared, and in darkness they could not control, a black woman was coordinating 60 children and a handful of exhausted adults with more intelligence than the owners had ever shown in comfort. Oppression always flatters itself with theories of superiority. Reality, when it breaks through, is usually humiliating. The marsh thickened as they moved east. Water pooled between root systems and disappeared beneath floating green scum that looked solid until a foot punched through. The mud changed texture every 20 yards, firm one moment, sucking and deep the next. Snakes moved in the reeds with that dry, sliding rustle that made even adults hesitate. Once, near a rotted log, Samuel Cox froze and pulled Nehemiah up short just as a banded water snake slipped across the path and vanished into a dark pocket beside the roots. Hester did not let the pause grow longer than necessary. Fear spreads by attention. She tapped Samuel's shoulder. Forward. A little later the water climbed again, this time higher than before. Not a crossing. A long, flooded stretch where the marsh had swallowed the path entirely. For the taller adults, it reached the upper thigh. For the older children, it pressed at the waist. For the smallest walkers, it rose to the ribs. That was where danger multiplied fastest. Children do not fail in such terrain because they lack bravery. They fail because bodies are small, breath is short, and panic wastes strength. Cora Bean began shivering so hard her teeth clicked. Jonah Farrell stumbled and swallowed marsh water before Elias hauled him upright. Aaron Peake nearly disappeared into a soft pocket that took him to the chest in one drop. Mara June shifted Obie higher and lost one shoe in the pull of the mud, then kept going barefoot because there was no time for recovery of anything that was not a life. Hester moved back and forth through that stretch with a branch in one hand and the infant lashed to her front. Probe, step, signal. Probe, step, signal. She tested each pocket before sending the next pair through. When the bottom gave too much, she angled them left. When a root shelf held, she marked it in memory and guided the others over the same unseen line. She was not moving by hope. She was moving by constant correction. That is what made her dangerous to the system pursuing her. Not rage. Not spectacle. Competence. Somewhere off to their west, an alligator entered the water with a heavy sliding drop. Then another farther off. Not close enough to strike the line, but close enough to remind every adult there what sort of country they had entered. In the dark, large reptiles did not need to be seen to do their work on the imagination. The children sensed it immediately. Bodies stiffened. Heads turned. One of the smaller boys made a choking sound of fear. Hester stopped the spread before it could become panic. "Eyes on the back in front of you," she said low and hard. "Not the water, not the sound." That was how she managed terror. She narrowed it, made it smaller than the world around them. Do not think about the swamp. Think about the next shoulder, the next hand, the next step. Grand fear destroys groups. Small instructions preserve them. They pushed on. The dogs had not vanished, but their voices came differently now, scattered, uncertain, farther behind than before. The riders too had lost speed. Horses do not love marsh edges. Men who boast about control from dry porches grow careful when the ground starts swallowing weight. That did not make the pursuers harmless. It only made them slower. Hester knew better than to interpret delay as mercy. Near dawn's first gray hint, they reached a stand of dwarf palmetto and twisted willow where the ground rose just enough for a brief halt. Not rest. A halt. Hester made them crouch low among the roots while she checked the children one by one. Nehemiah was burning with fever again. The infant Ruthie carried had gone limp with exhaustion, but still breathed. Dinah's lips were pale. Aaron's twisted foot had torn open at the heel. Obie had not spoken in over an hour. This was the cruel arithmetic of the marsh. Even when it did not kill outright, it stripped people down by increments: heat, cold water, insects, fear, hunger, the drag of mud, the strain on arms and backs. There is a violence in landscape when human beings are forced into it by other human beings. The swamp did not invent the crime. The plantation did. The marsh merely became its instrument. Hester handed out what little order could still be imposed. Older children wrung water from cloths and wrapped them again. Mara June rubbed feeling back into her numb forearm. Elias checked the feral twins for leeches without saying anything that would frighten them more. Old Ben Tom studied the paling sky through the cypress brakes and judged how much time remained before daylight turned concealment into a different problem. Hester herself did not sit. She stood half-bent, soaked to the skin, dress heavy with marsh water, face drawn tight with fatigue, and listened. Dogs behind, but weak now. Birds beginning. Insects constant. No close lanterns. No voices within striking distance. It was not enough to call them safe. It was enough to move again. What happened next was the clearest proof that she understood the children better than the men hunting them ever could. She rotated the carriers. Not because anyone asked, because she knew exhaustion makes people careless, and careless hands drop children. Samuel gave Nehemiah to Benjamin for the next stretch. Mara June surrendered Obie to Hester for 20 minutes, despite the raw pain of parting even briefly. Dinah was assigned only to hold Ruthie's dress hem and keep walking. Elias was told not to lead now, but to count under his breath, 1 to 20 and back again, because boys on the edge of panic often survive better when given rhythm. Hester knew this from nursery fevers, from storm nights, from the long education of tending frightened children in a place that profited from fear. Again and again the swamp tested them. A hidden root sent Ruthie to one knee. A sudden movement in the reeds made the youngest children flinch as one. Aaron vomited from exhaustion and tried to apologize. One of the feral twins whispered that he wanted his mother, though his mother had been sold 18 months earlier and could not possibly answer from that waterlogged dawn. Hester did not let grief take over the line, not because grief was unwelcome, because there would be time for grief only if they survived. By full morning on August 6th, the marsh had turned from black to gray-green. Shapes emerged, mats of reeds, pale driftwood, glistening mud, insect swarms hanging in shafts of weak light. With daylight came a different exposure. They could see more, and so could anyone searching from a distance. Hester angled the line deeper under cover, choosing the harder ground beneath tree shade over the slightly easier flats that might reveal movement. This too was command under pressure. Every easier route carried its own trap, and still the children moved, not gracefully, not heroically. They slipped, shivered, clung, stumbled, obeyed, cried silently, swallowed fear, and kept moving, because one woman had given them structure stronger than terror. That is what the record ought to say, plainly. Hester Vale did not lead them like a dreamer wandering toward freedom. She led them like someone who understood that in a world built to crush the weak, survival belonged to whoever could keep the line intact. By then, Belle Cendre's riders were no longer chasing a rumor. They were chasing a humiliation. The children had not scattered, they had not turned back, they had not dissolved into the swamp the way plantation men expected frightened young bodies to do. They were still together. And every mile that proved it made the accusation sharper. The people called property were showing more discipline, more foresight, and more humanity than the men who claimed the right to own them. By August 7, 1858, the men hunting through St. Mary Parish were no longer chasing what they had first imagined. At the beginning, Silas Brigg had treated the alarm at Belle Cendre like a familiar insult. He assumed a few field hands had slipped off in the dark, strong backs. Grown men, labor lost and recoverable. That was how men like Brigg measured disaster, by the value they believed had walked away from them. Their minds moved automatically toward cane rows, wagon loads, and the price of muscle. But by the second day, with the marsh swallowing trails and the hounds breaking scent again and again, the arithmetic changed. Riders came back with fragments instead of bodies, small footprints in the mud, torn cloth strips from infant wrappings, reed brakes too low to have been made by mounted men, one abandoned rag marked with milk stains, another with the sour smell of fever. The truth assembled itself in stages, and every stage made it worse. This was not a column of men escaping labor. This was the removal of children. That distinction was everything. Because slavery did not live on labor alone. Labor was only the visible engine. Beneath it was something colder and more durable, the claim that even the future could be owned. Children born into the quarters were not merely sons and daughters in the eyes of Belle Cendre. They were projected profit. Future field hands, future domestics, future collateral against debt, future bargaining pieces in the tidy language of inheritance, expansion, and sale. The nursery cabin was not, in truth, a place of mercy. It was part of the inventory system. That is the accusation polite history still too often softens. The crime was never only that people were forced to work. The crime was that birth itself was captured. Childhood was measured. Growth was monitored for value. A child's first steps, first teeth, first fever survived, first year endured. Every one of these could be folded into someone else's ledger. When Hester Vale led 60 children out of Belle Cendre's reach, she was not only removing vulnerable bodies from immediate danger, she was interrupting an economy of theft aimed at the next generation. Men like Edmund Devereux understood that immediately once the evidence became clear. He may not have seen the marsh with his own eyes on August 7, 1858. Owners often preferred distance from the filth that sustained them. But he would have heard the numbers. He would have heard Brigg's strained account, not 12 runaways. Not a half-dozen missing laborers. 60 children unaccounted for, along with several women, older youths, and a few elders capable of guiding them. That was not inconvenience, that was structural loss, and loss of that kind carried panic of a special sort. Not moral panic, not grief, property panic. One must be clear about this. The people who ruled Belle Cendre did not suddenly discover compassion because children were involved. Their outrage sharpened because children represented continuity. A grown man who fled deprived them of present labor. A child who vanished deprived them of years not yet extracted. A girl carried beyond their reach represented not only one missing life, but every future service they expected to take from her. A boy disappearing into the marsh was not merely one lost body in their eyes, but the erasure of a long line of anticipated control. This is why systems of domination become especially vicious when children are removed from them. It is not because they value innocence. It is because innocence has been converted into investment. Hester understood that long before the men in the yard managed to name it. By the morning of August 7th, she and the line behind her were deeper into the wet country northeast of Belle Cendre, moving between pockets of willow, cypress, and open stretches of muck that reflected the broken light like dull metal. The children were failing in increments, but still holding. Elias Reed had gone quiet in the dangerous way boys do when fatigue hardens into numbness. Ruthie Quinn was carrying her second infant of the march despite arms trembling so badly she had to lock her elbows to keep steady. Mara June's face had flattened into that expression beyond tears, where pain no longer asks to be noticed. Old Ben Tom's breathing rattled. Belle, only 9, had begun walking as if asleep, feet finding ground by habit more than thought. Hester kept them moving because she knew what the plantation had finally realized. Once the pursuit understood this was a rescue of children, not merely an escape of workers, the hunt would become broader, meaner, and more coordinated. Riders from neighboring properties might be pulled in, river landings watched. Road crossings checked. Marsh edges combed not for adult men likely to fight, but for signs of mothers, bundles, and frightened young walkers. The search had changed shape because the threat had changed shape. And the threat, from the plantation's point of view, was enormous. A black woman from the nursery had done what the law insisted she could not even conceive of doing. She had identified the true point of vulnerability in the system and struck there, not with weapons, with removal, not by burning fields, by taking the future the fields depended on. That was why Briggs' fury would have had a humiliated edge to it by now. It is one thing in such a world for a man to be defied by another man. Oppressors at least know how to narrate that to themselves. They can call it insolence, criminality, disorder. But to be outplanned by a woman they had trained themselves not to see as fully strategic? To discover that the person they treated as a caretaker had read the plantation more clearly than the overseer, the owner, and the clerk combined, that was harder to absorb. So the search widened. Lantern tracks appeared farther north than before. A skiff was reportedly sent along one narrow bayou, where Briggs guessed the group might try to cut east. Dogs were run in relays to make up for exhaustion. 2 men from a neighboring tract, the Broussard place, joined the pursuit for reward money. Every step of that response exposed the underlying truth. This was not a concern for safety. It was a campaign to reassert control over a stolen future. Meanwhile, Hester was organizing a different kind of order in the marsh. The children could no longer be moved simply in the pairings that had worked on the first night. Exhaustion had altered capacities. Stronger older children were weakening. Some of the youngest, carried for hours, had become dead weight in sleeping silence. A few small walkers, astonishingly, had entered that grim state where terror gave way to obedience. Hester noticed all of it. She reassigned constantly. Aaron Peake, whose twisted foot had nearly collapsed him the day before, was now slung between Benjamin Pike and Samuel Cox with a stripped branch used as a shared brace. Obie spent more time with Hester because Mara June's arm had lost strength. Nehemiah's fever was worse, so Ruthie walked beside him whispering counts under her breath to keep him responsive. Elias, though fraying, was still the most reliable at keeping younger boys from drifting, so Hester placed the Farrell twins and 2 others behind him and told him never to stop counting heads. This was not the work of a woman improvising blindly. It was logistics under moral pressure, and moral pressure matters here because Hester was not simply preserving bodies at random. She was preserving the human bonds the plantation had spent years degrading into units. Every reassignment she made was an act of recognition. This child is not cargo. This child must stay with a breathing protector. This frightened girl is not a burden to be dropped for speed. This feverish boy is not expendable because he slows the line. In a regime where efficiency always favored abandonment of the weak, Hester kept refusing that logic. That refusal is what makes this more than escape. It makes it indictment. By midday on August 7th, the sun had burned through the heavier cloud and turned the marsh into a brighter cruelty. Heat rose from the wet ground and wrapped around the children like a second illness. Insects found every exposed patch of skin. Mud dried in cracking layers on shins and feet. A baby cried at last, a thin, exhausted cry, more dangerous for being weak than loud. Hester took the child immediately and moved the line beneath denser cover. She did not rebuke the infant. Infants are innocent of strategy. It is adults who build worlds in which babies must be silenced to survive. Somewhere behind them, perhaps 2 miles, perhaps less, a horn sounded once and then again, searchers signaling each other. The children heard it. Several stopped without meaning to. Dinah turned with her whole body, eyes wide, as if the sound itself might take shape and seize her. Hester made them kneel low among palmetto and mud. Then she said something that would have sounded simple to anyone not listening carefully. They want the years ahead, she told the older children, voice almost flat from fatigue. Do not give them the years ahead. That was the heart of it. Not merely stay quiet, not merely keep moving. Understand what is being hunted, not only your body today. Your tomorrow. The older ones understood enough. Ruthie's face changed first, then Elias. They had both lived long enough inside Belle Cendre to know how younger children were discussed when white voices assumed black ears were not listening. Big enough to carry now. Nearly ready for the house. Good teeth, strong legs, worth something soon. Childhood had already been explained to them as a countdown into usefulness. Hester was giving that knowledge its proper name, theft planned in advance. This is why memory matters in stories like this. Because the worst crimes are often hidden behind routine language. Sale. Placement, training, service, adoption of responsibility. All those neat words, all those respectable tones, all those ledger entries meant to keep the powerful from saying plainly what they were doing. Hester had no patience left for euphemism. Neither should anyone hearing this story. Belle Cendre wanted the men, yes. Men cut cane, hauled loads, repaired ditches, drove carts. But what it needed, what it depended on, was the next generation staying inside reach. Hester took that reach away. By late afternoon, the line moved again, thinner now, more silent than before, as if speech itself had become too expensive. Children stumbled forward through reeds under hanging moss, across root shelves and shallow black channels. They were hungry. They were bitten raw by insects. They were carrying terror in small bodies that should never have known such distances, but they were still together. And every hour they remained together made the plantation's defeat more complete. Not because Belle Cendre had lost 60 names from a count, because it had lost the presumption that those names belonged in its count at all. At dawn on August 8, 1858, the Marsh finally began to loosen its grip. Not out of mercy. The Marsh had none. It had taken sleep, strength, skin, warmth, direction, and nearly every reserve left in the bodies moving through it. It had swallowed shoes, torn feet, confused the dogs, slowed the riders, and stripped the children down to instinct and obedience. But by the third morning, the ground beneath Hester Vale's line began to change. The water no longer rose so fast around every step. The roots thinned. The reed walls broke in places. Ahead, beyond a low belt of willow and scrub oak, lay the rise old Ben Tom had been trying to reach since the first night, Shellbank Ridge. It was not a mountain, not even a proper hill, just a long, stubborn spine of firmer land lifted slightly above the drowned country around it. In a better world, no one would have needed to know such places by survival value. But under slavery, geography became moral evidence. Every hidden ridge, every reed tunnel, every cut through black water testified to the same fact. People had to memorize the land because the law had memorized them first. By then, the group no longer looked like a column. It looked like aftermath. 60 children had entered the marsh. Most were still there, but the shape of endurance had changed them. Faces hollowed by hunger. Eyes fixed not on hope, but on the next safe footing, lips cracked, dresses stiff with dried mud, boys walking with the strange, careful gait of feet too swollen to trust the ground. 2 of the smallest children had to be half carried, half dragged between older bodies because their legs simply would not answer anymore. Dinah Belle, 9 years old, had gone beyond crying and beyond speech into the vacant silence of the deeply exhausted. Ruthie Quinn's arms shook continuously even when empty. Elias Reed still counted under his breath, but now the numbers broke apart, restarted, and broke again. Hester saw all of it. Wow. She never stopped seeing. That is what separated her from the world chasing her. The plantation counted bodies for ownership. Hester counted bodies for survival. The difference between those two forms of counting is the difference between civilization and its counterfeit. Old Ben Tom reached the lower edge of Shellbank Ridge first, probing with his branch, then stamping once to test the hold of the ground. It was real, not dry, not safe in any comforting sense, but firmer than anything they had crossed since leaving Belle Cendre. He turned and gave one low signal. Hester did not let relief spread uncontrolled. Relief can be dangerous before the danger is over. Children run when they think the trial has ended. Adults collapse too soon. Sound rises. Judgment slips. She had not carried 60 children this far to lose them to the foolishness of premature safety. Steady, she told them, voice worn flat by 3 days of command. Up slow, no one breaks away. So they climbed the ridge in the same discipline that had carried them through black water and fear, one pair at a time. Lift the smallest. Brace the weak. Keep the infants high. Watch the ones most likely to fall from shock now that the body sensed firmer ground. Hester moved among them, taking weight, shifting burdens, touching shoulders, checking the breathing of the fevered boy Nehemiah, steadying Aaron Peak when his damaged foot buckled on the incline. This was not the triumphant final stretch of legend. It was labor. Dirty, painful, exhausted labor performed by people whose humanity had been denied for so long that even their survival would later be treated as rumor rather than fact. At the crest of the ridge, the ground opened enough to show a narrow inlet beyond a stand of scrub. And there, half hidden in the morning haze, lay the reason Hester had held the line together, a concealed pickup point, little more than a sheltered bank where shallow craft could come in without being seen from the broader water. This is the part history often refuses to preserve clearly. Not because it lacks drama, because it carries accusation. A group that large does not survive 3 days in marsh country by courage alone. Courage matters, yes. So does discipline, so does leadership, but routes, timing, and extraction points suggest knowledge passed in whispers. Someone knew Shellbank Ridge could be used. Someone knew where the inlet opened. Someone knew a craft might be waiting, or at least could be summoned to wait beyond the easy reach of plantation riders. Was it a network of free black boatmen along the bayou? Was it a quiet arrangement built over months by women trading information through wash lines, churchyards, market errands, and nursery work? Was there a field hand on a neighboring property who marked the safest rise? Was there even, as later rumor hinted, a reluctant white deckhand or clerk who despised the trader system enough to look the other way at the right hour? No record worth trusting settles it cleanly, but the absence of a neat answer should not be used to shrink what happened. Too often, the powerful demand paper proof for acts they themselves worked hardest to keep off paper. The truth survives in patterns, and the pattern here is unmistakable. Hester Vale did not stumble into a miracle. She moved toward a point that had been judged worth reaching. Near the bank, a flat-bottomed skiff and a larger pirogue came in under cover of brush, guided by 2 black men and 1 older woman whose names never entered the respectable archives. That, too, is part of the indictment. The people who preserve the world in writing tend to omit the hands that actually changed it. Yet those hands were there in the dawn of August 8, 1858, pulling craft into reeds, laying boards across mud, lifting children whose bodies could no longer trust themselves to stand. No speeches were made, none were needed. The work began immediately. Infants first, then the fevered. Then the children too weak to walk. Then the younger pairs. Then the elders and the strongest remaining adults. Hester oversaw it with the same severity she had shown in the nursery yard on the first night. No crowding the boat edge. No calling names across the water. Keep low. Balance the load. Shift that child inward. Give Aaron the stern bench where the foot can rest. Put Dinah between Ruthie and Mara June because she is barely conscious. Lift Nehemiah carefully. Check the baby's breathing again. She did not board first. That detail matters because it tells you what kind of authority she exercised. Not authority for recognition. Authority for completion. She stayed on the bank until the last of the smallest children were placed. She counted again. Counted not with the greed of ownership, but with the desperation of witness. 1, 2, 3. All the way through the shivering, silent, mud-streaked remains of the line she had held together since August 5th. Not all could walk by then. Some had to be lifted like sleeping bundles. Some stared without focus. One little boy asked, in a voice almost too weak to hear, whether the dogs could swim that far. Another asked for his mother, forgetting for one fractured moment that Mara June was not his mother by blood and had carried him anyway. That is another truth the plantation never understood. Kinship under oppression widens because it must. Love becomes communal or it becomes insufficient. As the first boat pushed off, the ridge behind them remained quiet. No riders breaking through the brush. No dogs close enough to matter. The marsh had done its work. It had delayed the pursuit just long enough for planning, endurance, and luck to join hands. Luck should never be worshipped in stories like this, but neither should it be denied. A hidden route can fail. A child can cry at the wrong second. A boat can miss the inlet. A search party can guess correctly once. Oppression is powerful precisely because it turns survival into a chain of narrow margins. Hester knew that, which is why she refused sentiment even here. Only when the final craft was loaded did she allow herself to step in. She turned once, briefly, toward the marsh they had crossed. Behind that wall of reeds and cypress lay Belle Cendre plantation and every lie it had lived by. That black women were only caretakers, not strategists. That children born in the quarters would remain available for use. That order belonged to those who held whips, ledgers, and legal titles. That the future could be kept in a ledger if enough violence surrounded it. Shellbank Ridge answered those lies with fact. A black woman, written down nowhere important enough for the people in power, had outplanned the men who believed the parish belonged to them. She had not taken gold. She had not burned buildings. She had done something more devastating. She had removed the next generation from their reach. That is why stories like this are blurred at the edges in the record. Not because they are too small, because they are too revealing. Afterward, what happened became fragmented. A rumor in one parish, a warning in another, a whispered account among Black River workers about a woman who brought children out of the marsh in August of 1858, a planter's complaint about outside interference, a missing set of names that did not reappear where the ledgers expected them. Then, as so often happens, silence. Not natural silence. Manufactured silence. The kind built when a system is embarrassed by the proof of its own limits. But silence is not innocence. Silence is often concealment after defeat, so remember the shape of it plainly. 3 days. St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, August 5th to August 8th, 1858. 60 children. One black woman at the center, alligator marsh behind them, Shellbank ridge ahead, and a world built on ownership exposed for one hard stretch of dawn as weaker than the people it tried to break. Subscribe if you believe stories like this should be named, not buried, and comment your location below, plus your theory. Did Hester Vale act alone, or did someone inside that plantation world quietly help her move 60 children through the marsh to freedom?